Hello, everybody. Welcome to our first event of the year. We're here with Jack, who is going to give his talk on Sanskrit philosophy. So just a little bit about Jack. He is a graduate student and Canada Graduate Scholar working on the history of philosophy. His research explores issues in epistemology and metaphysics through the history of late classical and early modern Indian philosophy in Sanskrit. Jack, is there anything else you would like to note in your introduction?
So one of the people I work on in particular is someone who we're going to be talking about at length today, and that is Gaṅgeśa. And I work in particular on his epistemology and metaphysics and that of his commentators. So I'm very excited to talk about it. And so just kind of to get started, I want to tell you about one of my favorite things about working on the Sanskrit tradition. And that is, you'll often encounter these kinds of problems that if you've only read your American philosophy are completely new. They'll surprise you with these really interesting problems that you'd never thought about before. And then you'll start to think about the problem and maybe try and think about the solution. And then you'll find that, in fact, they've been thinking about it for centuries, and they've done all the work already to flesh out the option space, to kind of hone in on which theories don't work and which theories are the best. And so what I want to do is through the texts, I want to treat the text as philosophy and show you how brilliant these thinkers were. And through the text, introduce you to a problem you maybe have never thought about before, and wind up, I think, by sort of taking a tour through the history, winding up at a solution to a problem that I think looks right. And so to get started, I want to introduce the problem. I want you to consider the following case. So this is now page 1 on the handout. Call this case absent colleague. And so the case runs as follows. So suppose you've just come back from a busy department talk. You have to kind of imagine we're still in person again. But okay, so you've come back from a busy department talk and your colleague Sam wasn't in attendance. Now, the thing is, you weren't looking for them and you maybe didn't expect to see them. And so at the time you didn't notice that they weren't there. The next day you bump into another colleague who asks you if Sam was at the talk. So you think for a second and you notice now, later on, that your colleague Sam wasn't there. And so in Sanskrit terminology, these are so-called cases of past absence. And they pose some really interesting problems. So these kinds of cases happen all the time, right? Someone will ask you later on, hey, was so-and-so there? Or did you see so-and-so at the bar? Did you see such and such an item at the store? These are pretty common, and we're pretty good at getting them right. So they pose some questions. And the first I'll call the means question, which is sort of the problem we're really going to be thinking about today, is how does the agent become aware of past absence, right? And so this is a problem because the absence isn't around anymore, right? It's in the past, probably at a completely different location. So how is it that later on, after the fact, even though they didn't notice the absence, they come to realize that, say that your colleague was absent? Another kind of interesting question they pose is what I'll call the novelty question, which asks, does the agent gain knowledge about past absence? And so this is an interesting question. So one kind of flat-footed response you see sort of early in the tradition is to say, well, actually what happened was you did see the absence in just some sort of unconscious way. And then now later on, you are recalling the absence. So you're not learning anything, you're just recalling something you already knew, but didn't quite, but sort of weren't conscious of. So those two kinds of questions we're going to be thinking about. And so these cases first appear in the Sanskrit tradition as putative counterexamples to what I'll call perceptualist epistemologies of absence. The epistemology of absence asks, how do we know that something isn't there? And so these group of philosophers that I work on, and to whom Gaṅgeśa belongs, philosophers belonging to the Nyāya tradition, they have a really cool answer to this question. And their answer is, we learn of absence by perceiving absence. Absences are the kinds of things that we can perceive. We can see and hear and touch absence. There are things in the world that we can perceive. And we perceive them in much the same sense that we perceive color. But so here's supposed to be the problem for them. So this case I've given you involves a temporally and spatially distal absence. It's not around anymore. So how could you, for instance, see your colleague's absence? But the claim is, well, you actually seem to be learning that your colleague was absent, right? And you're learning that your colleague is absent without seeing their absence. So these are supposed to be counterexamples to perceptualism. And the first philosopher to offer these as counterexamples, this is a guy named Kumarila, writing in around 600 AD. And we're going to be thinking about people much later than Kumarila. So beyond serving as counterexamples, these cases kind of take on a life of their own. So on one hand, we have the one group of philosophers who gives you these cases as counterexamples, and they want to give you a theory because, well, they give them to you as counterexamples. Whereas Nyāya philosophers need to come up with an explanation for these cases because they defend perceptualism. So we have two groups of people with a stake in the debate. And we're going to be looking at two philosophers, one from each side. So what my goal is in the following is to look at an exchange between the Bhāṭṭa philosopher, Pārthasārathi. So Bhāṭṭas are going to be our one group. They're going to be one of our traditions. And then between him, who's writing around 1075, and the Nyāya philosopher, Gaṅgeśa, who's writing in about 1320. And they have a debate over how to account for knowledge of past absence. So Pārthasārathi wants to maintain that we learn of past absence by failing to recall a recollectible object or property. And we'll spell out those notions a bit later on. Whereas Gaṅgeśa identifies some pretty serious difficulties with this account, and he wants to mend it by treating sort of failure to recall a recollectible as the basis for inferential knowledge. And what I want to argue is that Gaṅgeśa's account, as it stands, isn't going to be immediately successful. But with a small tweak, I do think it provides us with what might be a very plausible, or what I think is a very plausible view for how these cases work. So just to get started then, so moving on to page 2, there's going to be two general views. And they're general in the sense that they're not just about these kinds of cases of past absence. They're general views in that they try to answer, how do we know about absence, whether that's present or past? How do we know about absence? And so one view, which we sort of already saw, is perceptualism. So we'll define perceptualism as the following view. And it says that perception is the most fundamental way in which an agent learns that an object or property is absent. So what I mean by fundamentality here is something like dependence. So basically, this is kind of Gaṅgeśa's formulation of this view. And the thought is basically that there is non-perceptual knowledge of absence, but in some way, all non-perceptual knowledge of absence depends on perceptual knowledge of absence. So there might be inferential knowledge of absence, there might be testimonial knowledge of absence, but this is all going to trace back in some way to perceptual knowledge of absence. So that's our first view. The second view, I'm going to call absentialism. So it's kind of not a super happy term. It's kind of it's a little gross, but it's the best we can kind of do to come up with a kind of term for this view. And this is very much a view unique to Sanskrit discussions of the epistemology of absence. So absentialism says that apprehension failure, one's failure to apprehend an object, is the only way in which an agent learns that an object or property is absent. This is Pārthasārathi's view. This is the view that Pārthasārathi wants to defend. All Bhāṭṭa philosophers defend this view. Pārthasārathi is a Bhāṭṭa philosopher, so he defends this view. And basically, the view here is that you learn non-inferentially that an object or property is absent just from failing to see or perceive in some other way that object under priming conditions. So the thought is this. So suppose you've stepped away from your laptop for a second. You're at a cafe and you've stepped away from your laptop and you come back and the laptop is missing. So the thought is you're expecting to see the laptop. So you're primed to see the laptop, but you don't see it. And you thereby know it's absent. It's not that you're seeing its absence. It's that you're not seeing the positive object. And that is how you learn that it's not there. And so this view is about so-called perceptible objects. So we'll say that an object is perceptible just in case the agent would have seen it had it been there. And this notion is important. This notion of a perceptible is important because, for instance, in pitch black darkness, there's a whole lot of objects that you're not seeing, but you don't know that they're not there, right? And that's because in pitch black darkness, those objects aren't perceptible. So that's the importance of that idea. Okay, Those are our two general views. So let's move on then sort of more specifically to views about these kinds of cases of past absence that I introduced at the start. And so what I want to start by doing is introducing you to briefly to some older views that precede Gaṅgeśa and Pārthasārathi. And it's interesting to look at these views because Pārthasārathi is going to do something very clever in a way that makes this theory much more robust than the old views. And to see why that is, we need to see why these older views don't work. So what I think we can do is distinguish two groups of views about the epistemology of absence. And we can distinguish them by their answer to the means question. So recall the means question asks, how is it that we learn of past absence? In what way do we learn of past absence? And so these earlier views I'll call recollection views, and they're united by the following shared minimal answer to the means question. Call this the recollection thesis. And it says that an agent becomes aware that a perceptible object or property was absent by recalling negative information about that object or property. So by negative information, I mean information, say, about absence, that something was absent, or that you failed to see an object. Those are all cases of negative information. And one view, one perceptualist view you find early on, is this kind of like the flat-footed view I mentioned at the start. So the philosophers Nyāya and Bhāṭṭa, they're not going to be important, but they have this one view that says that what happens is you sort of unconsciously perceive sort of the general absence of everything in a scene. And then with the right prompt later on, you kind of recall a more specific absence out of that general absence. The details aren't super important, but the point there is that you actually did see the absence at the time, and what you're recalling is the absence. And so again, so that delivers a negative verdict to the novelty question. Another view that you find is one that belongs to the Bhāṭṭa philosopher Gaṅgeśa, Pārthasārathi's predecessor by a few hundred years. And Gaṅgeśa has a view according to which what happens in these cases is you later on with the right prompt recall that you failed to see, say, your colleague at the talk, and you thereby come to learn that they were absent. And these are all recollection views, and they suffer from a very interesting problem. And that's a problem raised by the Bhāṭṭa philosopher, again, another Bhāṭṭa, Sucharita. And this is a problem called the selection problem. And this is kind of funny because this is accidentally sort of an own goal, because like this problem actually applies to Gaṅgeśa's view, though it's not obvious that Sucharita wants that to be the case. He wants it to be a problem for people like Nyāya and Bhāṭṭa, but it actually is a problem for everyone that has this kind of view. And so the problem is the following. These kinds of older views, they're built on this idea that agents uncode unconscious negative information into memory. That's to say that agents can survey a scene, encounter a lot of absences, and later on recall those absences. So they can see and then recall these absences. They're stored in memory. Information about those absences is stored in memory. But the problem is, no conditions obtained at the time when the agent initially encounters the absence, right, our past absence, that restrict which negative information is selected for encoding, right? So go back to our case of absent colleague. You weren't searching for your colleague. You didn't expect to find them, something like that. And so nothing is really going on that's restricting what information gets encoded into memory. And so the problem is, if you have a recollection view and you think that unconscious negative information is encoded into memory, you should think that all unconscious negative information is encoded into memory. You should basically have infallible recollection of all the absences in the scene, right? Nyāya actually kind of explicitly commits himself to this principle. This principle is implausible. And since it's implausible, recollection views have to be true because they're built on the principle. So it can't be that these cases of past absence involve us somehow recalling some negative information and learning that something was absent. Which brings us to Pārthasārathi then. So the second group of views that we can identify, I'm going to call recollection failure views. And Pārthasārathi kicks them off. And again, they're united by a minimal answer to the means question. And this answer is going to do something very clever. So let's have a look at it. So call this a recollection failure thesis. And it says that an agent becomes aware that a recollectible object or property was absent by failing to recall positive information about that object or property. So what Pārthasārathi does is he flips the negative. So these old recollection views, they say, well, what these cases involve is recalling negative information, and Pārthasārathi says they involve failing to recall positive information. We flip the negative. And by flipping the negative, we avoid this problem wherein we build into our view this principle that you have to be able to unconsciously encode negative information into memory. So it's very clever. And we've introduced a new notion here. We've now introduced this notion of a recollectible object. We'll define that as we do. We'll define that basically analogously to how we define the notion of a perceptible object. So we'll say that an object is recollectible just in case the agent would recall it had it been there. And so just to give you a sense of what this is doing, let's have a look at the third marginal note here on the right. So imagine a situation in which you've been given a day of you're on a day of no sleep, and then you're given under a minute to look at a random list of numbers. And then say 1 week later on, maybe again on the day without any sleep, you're then asked to recall whether the number 73 was on that list. Now, even if 73 had been there, you wouldn't be able to recall as much, right? You're just too tired. You weren't given enough time to survey the numbers. So you're failing to recall that 73 is on that list, but you don't thereby know that 73 was on that list because 73 isn't recollectible given your conditions. So that's the importance of this notion of a recollectible object or property. And so Pārthasārathi gives us the first absentialist recollection failure view. Just call this Pārthasārathi's view, and it says that an agent learns non-inferentially that a recollectible object or property was absent just from failing to recall that object or property. This is best illustrated with Pārthasārathi's case, which is really kind of like, it's a really fun case. So I've got Pārthasārathi here. I've got the translation in the second marginal note, but I'll just kind of like flesh out his case for you and call this absent tigers and kings. And the case runs as follows. So suppose someone is out for a stroll in the morning. On their stroll, on their walk, maybe they're running an errand, they don't run into any tigers, lions, elephants, or kings. But of course, they're not looking for any of these things. And so this person doesn't take any note of their absence. Someone then sort of later on asked them like the really bizarre question. When you were on your walk, did you encounter any tigers, lions, elephants, or kings? And with that prompt, the agent in our case, our protagonist, realizes they didn't. And they come to know that none of those things were there. So the thought is basically this. You can't recall encountering the king on your walk. And just in virtue of being able to recall the king, who you would recall, had they been there, you would have noticed the king. Or you would have noticed an elephant just in the middle of the road. In virtue of being unable to recall, you know that it wasn't there. And so what's sort of important to notice about this case, though, is that we have a bunch of highly recollectible or highly salient features of an environment, right? An elephant on the road is the kind of thing that's immediately going to stand out to you. It's the kind of thing that you're guaranteed to notice, right? If, he tweaks this case to really hammer home this point. And in fact, let's actually read Pārthasārathi because he's actually a really engaging author. So here's Pārthasārathi, the fourth marginal note on the right on page 3. So he says, granted, the conditions for being perceptible don't obtain, right? These absences, the objects that are absent, they're in the past, so the objects aren't perceptible anymore. But then he introduces this notion, but the conditions for being recollectible do. Since it must be that those seated in an assembly, attended by thousands of people, should right away grasp a lion or a king that came to the assembly. And if at midday they wanted to recall the lion or the king, they should recall. And this very failure to recall, even when one should recall, where it obtains at the time of midday, that produces awareness of the absence from the morning. So he's tweaked the case to make it even more dramatic. So call this case now the assembly. So basically, we're given a case in which we're told to imagine that thousands are gathered at a morning assembly. Presumably, had a lion or a king wandered in, inevitably news is going to spread among the crowd. And so if prompted later in the day to recall whether a lion had wandered in, lion or a king, those who attended should be able to recall with ease, but they don't. And so the thought is they thereby know a lion wasn't there. So just to give you like one more case to think about, and forgive the silly example, but there was no bear in your kitchen this morning, right? Had there been a bear in your kitchen, that's the kind of thing you would have noticed. You wouldn't notice a bear in your kitchen. And so just in virtue of being unable to recall the bear in your kitchen, you learn non-inferentially that it was absent. That's Pārthasārathi's claim. Which brings us then to Gaṅgeśa. So what does Gaṅgeśa make of this? Well, Gaṅgeśa thinks Pārthasārathi has some problems. So the problem is basically this. So to support his view that knowledge of past absence is non-inferential, Pārthasārathi cherry picks these cases of robustly recollectible objects, thinking about things like kings or lions, right? But what Gaṅgeśa thinks we can do is we can focus on cases in which the object is recollectible enough for knowledge of past absence, but not as recollectible as a bear in your kitchen. So I'm not going to read Gaṅgeśa, I'm just going to flesh out his case. And so it runs as follows. Call this case absent Maitra. So Chaitra has just left a crowded house where an event was being held. During his time in the house, he variously visited all the rooms. And on his way home, he bumps into a friend who then asks him, was Maitra there? Now, Maitra is a colleague from another department, but he and Chaitra are by no means close. It happens, however, that Chaitra never saw Maitra at the event. So he thinks for a moment. But that's going to be key here. He thinks briefly. And he realizes Maitra wasn't there. So he reports as much. So what's going on in this case is something different than these kinds of cases Pārthasārathi gives you. Pārthasārathi wants to focus on these cases in which an agent knows immediately that something wasn't there, right? He and all of Kumarala's commentators, they use this phrase, the daiva, right at that time. So right upon being asked, you learn that something wasn't there, right? And this makes good sense, right? Like if I ask you, was a bear in your kitchen this morning? You're not going to need to pause to think. You just say, no, a bear wasn't in my kitchen this morning. Like, why would you even be asking me that question, right? And so Pārthasārathi's cases work like that, but Gaṅgeśa's doesn't. So that's because Maitra, in this case, isn't as recollectible as a bear in your kitchen, right? And what that means is that Chaitra has to pause for a second. Chaitra has to pause to think about whether Maitra was absent. And really, most cases are like this, right? We're more likely to wonder, was, so-and-so at the bar? Was so-and-so at the talk? Was this or that item at the store, right? These cases are more common than these bizarre kind of artificial cases where we're like, hey, did you see an elephant in the road, right, on your walk to work? And so Gaṅgeśa thinks we have some problems for Pārthasārathi. And he thinks these are the two problems. Let's read Gaṅgeśa again. So let's start reading Gaṅgeśa. This is the third marginal note on the right, just at the bottom. So he says, Pārthasārathi's view. In that case, i.e. your case that you've just given us, the case of absent Maitra, what causes an agent to grasp Maitra's absence in the house is just unconscious failure to recall the house, which is recollectible as containing recollectible Maitra. To which Gaṅgeśa responds, no. Since if recollection failure in and of itself causes an agent to grasp absence, it follows problematically that there would be no error or doubt with respect to absence. And sometimes there is error. It was there. And sometimes there's doubt. Was it there or not? So this is Gaṅgeśa's first objection, which says that there's no room, Pārthasārathi's account leaves no room for uncertainty and error about these cases of past absence. So since Chaitra is failing to recall a recollectible, Pārthasārathi's account delivers the verdict that Chaitra should know Maitra was absent, right? He's not recalling Maitra. And just in virtue of that, he should know Maitra was absent. But the thing is, Chaitra is initially uncertain, right? And it's possible that he gets it wrong. But Pārthasārathi doesn't seem to have an explanation for that. Because, again, Chaitra is failing to recall Maitra and should thereby know. And the other problem, and this is one we'll see a little bit later in the text, is that Gaṅgeśa thinks there's no room for that pause, right? So Chaitra has to pause to think about the question, was Maitra there or not? But according to Pārthasārathi's view, he's failing to recall a recollectible, and just in virtue of doing so, he should know that Maitra was absent. And so the problem then is, in kind of a nutshell here, is that Pārthasārathi wants to take this kind of felt immediacy in his cases, in which you immediately know that something was absent. And he wants that to show that knowledge of past absence is sort of, we'll say, causally direct. It doesn't involve any intervening steps like an inference does. But this creates the problems for Pārthasārathi. If all knowledge of past absence is causally direct or causally immediate, that should entail felt immediacy in absent Maitra. But there's no felt immediacy in such cases, right? These cases take time to kind of parse through. And so really the lesson here is Pārthasārathi starts with the wrong group of cases. His cases work with his view. But when you step back and look at more common cases, his view can't explain them. So those are Gaṅgeśa's objections. Then let's move on to how Gaṅgeśa wants to respond. So this is page 5 now. So through this exchange, I think we can identify two sort of important desiderata for an account of past absence. The first we'll call fallibility and uncertainty, which corresponds to the first objection. And it says something like, an account of past absence must explain how an agent can be wrong about or doubt whether a recollectible object or property was absent, even if they fail to recall the object or property. That's what our account needs to do. That's one thing our account needs to do. Another thing our account needs to do is capture what I call conscious reasoning. And it says that an account of past absence must explain why an agent in many cases consciously reasons about whether a recollectible object or property was absent. So Pārthasārathi's account doesn't do either of these things. But Gaṅgeśa thinks the account is actually close to working. It just needs some tweaks. So just to start by highlighting the differences between the accounts we're going to get. Pārthasārathi, again, wants to treat the failure to recall a recollectible in and of itself as the cause of knowledge of past absence. And in doing so, he foregrounds quick, indeliberate attempts to retrieve information from memory. But Gaṅgeśa is going to do something a little bit different. He's going to say, failure to recall a recollectible, that's good. We need that, right? He's got a recollection failure view. So it doesn't suffer from the problems that these old views did. But it's not enough in and of itself. We need a second ingredient, and that is an inference. So failure to recall a recollectible is the basis for inferential knowledge on his view. And what he wants to do is foreground slower, deliberate attempts to retrieve information from memory. Which brings us to, actually, let's read Gaṅgeśa again. This is actually kind of a nice passage. Gaṅgeśa is typically a terrible writer, but this is a nice passage, actually. So this is the first marginal note on the right. So he says, when an agent paying careful attention ascertains that he fails to recall Maitra, who can enter into the content of a single awareness and whom he would recall had he undergone a first-hand awareness of him, then he has inferential knowledge of his absence. So it follows that, having observed the deviation of mere recollection failure, having set it aside, a specific kind of failure to recollect. He says, deliberate recollection on the part of the person inquiring, that's employed in inference. And then here's the second objection that I highlighted. Otherwise, reflection would be unexplained, since recollection failure just by itself would cause an agent to grasp absence. Therefore, failure to recall a recollectible is employed as an inferential mark. So the view is this. An agent learns that a recollectible object or property was absent by inferring its past absence on the basis of deliberately directing their attention towards attempting to recall the object or property and being unable to do so. And so kind of an important feature of this view is that it's neutral on whether episodic or semantic memory is in play. Which is to say, one very kind of natural construal, so just to unpack these notions, one very sort of natural construal of what's going on in these cases is to say that like Chaitra has to pause to think. And then when he's pausing to think, what he's doing is he's replaying, say, the scene of the house. He's visually imagining it, and he doesn't recall Maitra being there. And on that basis, he infers Maitra's absence. So that would be episodic memory. And that's like one natural way to construe what's going on in this account. But Gaṅgeśa's account is neutral on that. And so he's not saying that that's the only way these cases work. And so how does this view capture these desiderata? Well, Gaṅgeśa thinks it captures fallibility and uncertainty in the following way. The agent, so the view is that the infallibility is brought in by the infallibility of introspection. So the thought is that the agent might be uncertain whether they're failing to recall the recollectible. Like, I can't quite recall if my throat was there or not. I'm not quite certain if I recall my throat. Or they might just be mistaken about whether or not they recall my throat. So they might actually just be like wrong about whether or not they recall my throat. So that's how we get that desideratum. Then he thinks the account also captures conscious reasoning by doing the following. Here, what's important to observe is that simply failing to recall on Gaṅgeśa's view isn't enough. You need a little bit more. And that is, you need the inference, right? That's one thing. You need the inference. And the other thing is that Gaṅgeśa's foregrounding these deliberate recall attempts, which explains why someone like Chaitra has to pause to think. Well, he has to pause to, the recall attempt is a bit more demanding in these kinds of cases. And so that's what's sort of introducing these pauses. So that's Gaṅgeśa's view. And I think it's right. But before we get to that, here's why I can't quite be right already, or can't quite be right yet. So moving to the last page then. So we could do something kind of interesting here. Gaṅgeśa had this strategy where he tried to apply Pārthasārathi's account to his cases, right? What if we reverse that strategy? What if we apply Gaṅgeśa's view to Pārthasārathi's cases? Well, it looks like Gaṅgeśa has the opposite problem now that Pārthasārathi had. It seems that his account should entail that there'd be no felt immediacy in cases like absent tigers and kings, right? Again, we're foregrounding these slow, deliberate recall attempts, which should entail these kinds of pauses in all cases. But that's not right? Remember, the bear in the kitchen. You don't need to pause to think of whether there was a bear in your kitchen this morning. You know right away there wasn't a bear in your kitchen. So Gaṅgeśa's account seems to have kind of gone a little bit off the rails with these kinds of cases, Pārthasārathi's cases, which is basically to say, when robustly recollectible objects are involved, when highly salient features of the environment are involved, these recall attempts don't look demanding, right? So there's something more Gaṅgeśa's account needs to capture. That's what I'll call immediacy. So immediacy says an account of past absence must explain why an agent in some cases immediately knows that a highly salient recollectible object or property was absent. And so this isn't in tension with conscious reasoning, because there's a whole gamut of cases here where the objects are really recollectible. Immediacy comes into play when the objects are like weakly recollectible, but still enough for past absence or for knowledge of past absence. Immediacy isn't in play, and we need something like conscious, and we need to explain something like conscious reasoning. But I think actually Gaṅgeśa's account is pretty easy to mend here. So what he needs to do to capture this desideratum is just allow that shifts in how robustly recollectible an object is entail shifts in how demanding the recall attempt is. So the thought is something like this: as objects become less recollectible, right, harder to recall that object, the recall attempt becomes increasingly deliberate and demanding. And when the object becomes more recollectible, like in Pārthasārathi's cases, the recall attempt becomes increasingly immediate and less deliberate. And so I think once you do that, you capture everything you need. So just to take stock and summarize quickly then, these kinds of earlier recollection views that we saw, they suffered from what I call the selection problem, which comes from the philosophy of Sucharita. Since these kinds of views maintain that cases of past absence involve recalling negative information. Gaṅgeśa's view, which is a recollection failure view, with Pārthasārathi, he flips the negative. These views avoid that problem. But Pārthasārathi's account was unable to explain uncertainty and error about past absence, and why in many cases of past absence, the agent pauses to reflect. By treating knowledge of past absence as inferential and foregrounding these kinds of deliberate recall attempts, Gaṅgeśa's account doesn't struggle with these issues. But his account does struggle with the following. It's initially unable to explain this kind of felt immediacy that we get in these cases, like when I ask you, was there a bear in your kitchen this morning? But Gaṅgeśa's account, I think, is very easy to mend, and once mended can handle Pārthasārathi's cases. And so my conclusion is, with a tweak, I think Gaṅgeśa provides us with a highly plausible, or maybe even right, account of how we come to know of absence in retrospect. And I'm going to end there. So thanks a lot.